A couple of weeks back, the Academy announced that Sony's Madame Web was ineligible to compete for the Best Picture Oscar. Ostensibly, this was due to recently enacted bylaws, but I think we all know the real reason was to prevent a complete award season sweep, ensuring that Madame Web didn't win everything. It's just fair to the other movies. There you go.
Oh, thanks. You don't think that maybe in light of recent events I could use a beer?
But that's okay, because the Sony Pictures universe of Marvel characters, or the Spamunk for short, didn't have its eggs in one basket. There was another.
A hero. Not the hero we deserved, but the hero we needed.
That's right, it was a very Kraven Christmas. This new year, everybody was Kraven the Hunter. In fact, I know for a fact that Kraven was named People Magazine's Sexiest Man Alive, but he turned it down, so they had to go to the next name on the list. Think of the possibilities. Television spin-offs, sequels, NFL tie-ins. It's Kraven's world, we're just living in it, baby. Except we're not really. So, this week, we're going to take a look at Sony Pictures' Kraven the Hunter. We're going to talk about why the movie is the way that it is.
Look at what you became.
How it was clearly restructured and rebuilt in post-production.
This is kind of real. Can it?
And the telltale signs of a movie that has been torn apart and stitched back together clumsily. We're not going to focus too much on the plot here. We're not going to nitpick storytelling choices. We're not going to delve into comic book continuity. We're not even going to unpack the inherent absurdity of building an entire shared universe around Spider-Man characters that somehow does not feature Spider-Man himself.
I'm not sure how I got here. Has to do with Spider-Man, I think.
We're going to talk about how movies like this get made. We're basically going to ask, why is Kraven the Hunter? In terms of understanding why Kraven the Hunter is the way that it is, there are a few important details to understand. The first is that the film was first rumored in June 2017, coinciding with the hype around Spider-Man Homecoming. Richard Wenk, who retains both a screenwriting and story credit on the finished film, was announced as writer in August 2018. Now, the film hit a couple of development snags around the production of Sony's big Spider-Man trilogy and a massive global pandemic, but the wheels started turning again in mid-2021 when J.C. Shander was announced as director and Aaron Taylor Johnson was announced to play Kraven himself. It really gained traction in early 2022, with February and March seeing the announcement of a cast including Russell Crowe, who was the Gladiator from Gladiator, Christopher Abbott, who is the Wolfman in The Wolfman, Alessandro Nivola, who had a face in Face Off, Fred Heschinger, who was one of the two in Gladiator 2, and Ariana DeBose, who was in the world in Westworld. What do you want from me? Filming began in March and ended in June, by all accounts a perfectly reasonable production cycle for a movie like this. Aaron Taylor Johnson noted that the film had been shot entirely on location. Kraven the Hunter was originally dated for release in January 2023, which allowed for a fairly reasonable amount of post-production time on a modern blockbuster. Then it was moved to October 2023. By the way, this October 2023 release date would have nicely coincided with the release of the PlayStation game Spider-Man 2, which features Kraven the Hunter as a major antagonist. That seems like a perfectly reasonable place for that cross-market synergy that Hollywood studios are always going on about. Then, using the actors and writers' strike as cover, it was moved to August 2024. Then, just because, it was moved to December 2024, almost 2 years after the film's original planned release date of January 2023. And look, I think we can all agree that those 2 years were definitely worth it. Obviously, nobody has talked about what actually happened to Kraven the Hunter. Modern studio movie making means that everybody involved is effectively NDA'd to death. All of what follows is going to be educated supposition based on what we know about the film going into post-production, the finished product, and the way that movies generally get made. Kraven the Hunter is the fifth feature film from director J.C. Shander, whose career consisted of making the kind of movies that don't really exist in the modern studio ecosystem. He made 3 movies in his first 3 years as director, but it took him a decade to make his next 2 films. One of those movies went straight to streaming, and the other, well, it's the one we're talking about this week. Now, to be clear, Chandler isn't necessarily the greatest single director of his generation, but he does make thoughtful mid-budget movies that used to be a feature of the Hollywood landscape. He's a strong set of aesthetic and thematic concerns. In particular, his films are obsessed with the idea of the void as a concept and humanity's self-destructive impulses.
The feeling that people experience when they stand on the edge like this isn't a fear of falling. It's a fear that they might jump.
But the real answer to your question is that when it feels scary to jump, Ian, that is exactly when you jump.
It does seem like Kraven the Hunter was originally meant to be a J.C. Chandor film. It features two cast members who worked with Chandor in A Most Violent Year, Christopher Abbott and Alessandro Nivola. Indeed, Nivola is the only actor who escapes Kraven the Hunter with his dignity intact, pitching his performance at the right level.
Faster than a cheetah, cunning as a fox, more ferocious than a tiger.
It's a shame that his work won't be recognized this year, because the only other movie Nivola's in this season is something called The Brutalist, and that doesn't really seem to be going anywhere. We don't need to worry about that. Even outside of the reunion with Abbott and Nivola, Crowe seems like the perfect fit for Chandor's aesthetic, which includes actors like Ben Affleck, Robert Redford, Jeremy Irons, Demi Moore, and other people who would have been features of the kinds of movies that would have been staples of video stores and cable television at the turn of the millennium, which is a spirit that lives on in J.C. Chandor's filmography. Hell, you can see traces of that in the finished film if you look hard enough, which opens on a fairly blatant homage to John McTiernan's The Hunt for Red October. Kraven the Hunter also includes a fairly direct invocation of dad movie classic Dances with Wolves, and inexplicably references Ridley Scott's Gladiator. Oh, wait. I see what he's doing. There's not really an inexplicable reference to Ridley Scott's Gladiator, point taken. Hell, there's even a very, very, very stupid reference to The Godfather crammed in here.
Michael Corleone says hello.
The rhino sends his regards.
Actors' statements from production emphasize the use of real locations. Nivola boasted that while his character, the gangster known as the Rhino, transformed physically at the movie's climax, he, quote, didn't have to do any CGI. Now, let's look at the finished film. So, yeah. Filmmaking has always involved a large amount of post-production, including reshoots and automated dialogue replacement, a process known as ADR. This isn't anything new. Older movies would use reshoots to rework existing material, and often studios would have actors come in to dub lines over their scenes, either because the line wasn't clear in the audio track from the set, because a plot point needed clarification, or to provide exposition. The idea is that you can play these re-recorded dialogue snippets over shots where the character's mouth isn't on screen, whether because the camera's focused on another object or because they have their back to the viewer.
Ash? Any suggestions from you or Mother?
No, we're still collecting.
You what? You're still collating? I find that hard to believe.
What would you like to do?
Just what you've been doing, Ash. Nothing. I've got access to Mother now, and I'll get my own answers, thank you.
These techniques aren't inherently bad. Indeed, many of the best movies ever have made heavy use of ADR. Alien, for example, ADR's this exchange between Parker and Ripley to explain the perfectly reasonable question of why Ripley is going to turn back on the killer robot.
Parker, will you plug it in?
I don't know what.
Because he may know how to kill it.
This exchange is also not in the final script draft. Honestly, you can do really cool things with ADR. One of my favorite examples is this scene from Star Trek II: The Wrath of Khan, in which Spock speaks with his young student Saavik. The scene was originally filmed in English. Director Nicholas Meyer had the clever idea that the two should converse in Vulcan to better underscore the distance between these characters and their human colleagues, so he hired linguist Mark Okrand to create the language from scratch. Okrand rewrote the scene in Vulcan, but he matched the phonetics to the already filmed lip movements of the actors so that Leonard Nimoy and Kirstie Alley dubbed over their performances, making different sounds with the same lip movements. It's just a really clever thing to have done. In contrast, ADR is somewhat less elegant when studios decide to do something like, say, rewrite the entire movie in post-production. Madam Web is a great example of this, where it's very obvious that nearly every line from Ezekiel Stain has been redubbed in post-production.
Every night, the same vision. It's a curse.
Meaning that he never seems to move his lips while talking. And when he does, he says something that makes no sense whatsoever.
I will find them and kill them first.
Now, there are several reasons why you might do this, to completely erase an actor's accent choice in post-production, for example, but it's also a way to heavily rewrite the plot. Kraven the Hunter features a lot of ADR. There are a lot of shots of characters providing plot or character-centric information while their mouths are not visible on screen or during insert shots of props.
I heard back from one of my sources. The rhino's on the move. We should know more very soon.
There's even this moment.
Look at what you became.
Which was so surreal that I was convinced I must have hallucinated in the theater until I picked up my digital copy.
Hold it. Run that back.
Let's enhance it.
Look at what you became. Look at what you became.
And look, it's great that modern studio blockbusters have all the production value of a Conan O'Brien talk show. Which brings us neatly to the other big tool used to rewrite a movie in post-production, visual effects. A lot of modern movies are heavily reworked through reshoots and visual effects, with Marvel famously allocating a portion of their budget towards doing reshoots and fixing it in post. So how's that working for everybody? Reshoots are difficult to organize because actors tend to be pretty busy and they tend to have hectic schedules that often compete with one another, so it's hard to get multiple actors back on set at the same time. It's also very hard to use the same location, both because of budget constraints, but also because the location may simply not be available anymore. So throughout Kraven, you'll notice that there are sequences where scenes will shift from what appears to be actual location work to sloppy green screen work. And where something will happen that should probably include Russell Crowe, like say his child being loaded into a helicopter, but for some reason doesn't. You'll also notice a lot of shot-reverse shot compositions where characters converse but aren't in the same shot together. Again, this is just standard filmmaking technique, there's nothing inherently wrong with it. Infamously, the coffee scene in Heat does not include a master shot of both Pacino and De Niro facing one another, despite the fact that such material was shot. Director Michael Mann felt that including such a master shot would take the viewer out of the conversation. However, both De Niro and Pacino were on set together while filming, and the sequence involves some great acting. So, in contrast, you could tell me that no three members of Kraven the Hunter were on set at the same time throughout the movie's production. So, if you look at Kraven with all of this in mind, you can sort of piece together how the movie might have been changed in post-production and get a sense of what the overarching motivation behind these changes was. Let's start with a couple of examples.
3, motherfucker.
Nobody, and I mean nobody, suffers worse from ADR than Ariana DeBose, who is just having one of those all-time career slumps for a Best Supporting Actress Oscar winner, doing very little to dispel the widely held notion that the Supporting Acting Award category is fundamentally cursed. DeBose plays the character Calypso, and it feels like most of Calypso's arc was reworked through reshoots, to emphasize the character's mysticism and action girl bona fides. The tarot cards are a major recurring motif, but they only appear in a single shot with DeBose, the rest being obviously reshot scenes involving a child actor, or insert shots with terrible voiceover, or clumsily added ADR while the doctor's back is turned to the camera.
The EMTs found that card in your pocket.
Even that shot that I mentioned with DeBose and the cards, that feels like it was heavily reshot because it's an exposition scene between DeBose and Taylor Johnson that is immediately followed by another exposition scene between DeBose and Taylor Johnson. That second scene, by the way, has much less emphasis on the mysticism and much more emphasis on the grounded urban thriller aspect. There's a clear sense in which the reshoots were designed to lean more heavily into Calypso as a B-tier comic book character steeped in outdated cliches about magic and mysticism, rather than emphasizing her more grounded role within this narrative as a lawyer helping Kraven unearth a criminal conspiracy. A lot of DeBose's ADR emphasizes the magic serum that Calypso fed Kraven in the reshot flashbacks.
I was just a kid. Look at what you became.
Even the line about Calypso's experience with a bow and arrow, which sets up the killing of the foreigner at the climax, is another really clumsy example of ADR.
Actually, I'm pretty good with one of these things.
By the way, while we're talking about him, let's actually talk about him. Obviously, Chris Rabbitt was announced early in casting, but it's obvious that his role as the henchman known as the Foreigner was heavily reshot. By the way, the Foreigner, that's what we're going with here?
That's really offensive. No wonder everyone keeps invading you.
The Foreigner spends most of the movie wandering around places where the heroes were, but narrowly missing them, and also being shot in completely different locations. At one point, one poor actor leaves a conversation with Calypso to walk to a conversation just upstairs, we swear, with the Foreigner, and then has to repeat the exposition from that conversation with Calypso. Which, to be clear, the Foreigner could just have given to Calypso himself because Calypso does not know who he is, what he looks like, or what he's doing. As with Calypso, there's a strong sense that this stuff is designed to amplify the comic book nature of the character, such as his ability to stop time. There are hints of a much more grounded motivation for the Foreigner, including the idea that he is trying to avenge the death of his mentor, which Kraven is responsible for. But all of that gets downplayed in favor of whatever this is. Pointedly, the entire exposition dump that he gives in the third act of the movie about the magic fear toxin is ADR'd over insert shots of the gun.
I find this formula that was developed by MI6 to be particularly effective.
And I guess we gotta talk about that too. It seems safe to assume that a lot of the visual effects work was a way for the studio to rewrite Kraven the Hunter in post-production. This is standard Hollywood practice. It's part of the exploitation of visual effects artists, who aren't unionized and so don't enjoy the same protection as actors or other crew members. So studios can change all sorts of details in the crunch running up to release. Within the industry, this is known as pixel fucking.
Listen, can we VFX AC Mossmen? Insanely expensive, it looks shit, and the additional workload might actually kill me.
Could actually do it.
At me? Yes, thank you, Jamie.
Changes can be so severe that they effectively rework the entire plot of the movie. So, it seems likely that this entire sequence in which Kraven is shot with a gun that makes him see his worst fears was a late addition. Kraven's fear of spiders is not set up at any prior point in the movie, despite repeated references to his love of wildlife and nature. The Foreigner's ability to stop time seems like enough of a gimmick for him earlier in the film that he doesn't need a magic fear toxin. So this is transparently just nonsense added for the sake of nonsense. Again, as with the obvious changes made to Calypso and the Foreigner, it's easy to understand why the studio did this. It's an obvious allusion to the beloved comic book story Kraven's Last Hunt, which is built around Kraven's obsession with spiders, which drives him to hunt, you guessed it, Spider-Man. Pointedly, the promise of a faithful adaptation of Kraven's Last Hunt was dangled in front of fans as a way of incentivizing the movie's box office.
You know, quite frankly, all those people in the comment sections, they want to see Kraven's Last Hunt. You know, there's one way to get it there, right? Which is that this film is a success.
It's a great comic, and you should absolutely read it. It's one of the best Spider-Man stories ever told. However, this hallucination referencing these panels from this comic book make no sense in the context of Kraven the Hunter, where Spider-Man seemingly does not exist, and if he does, he has nothing to do with the plot of this movie. I've watched the movie so closely so many times, and I have yet to Spider-Man. As with the Foreigner and Calypso, this stuff has clearly been added for the sake of making the movie more comic booky, without any regard for whether it actually makes sense.
Bonus! He's actually wearing a costume like he's not embarrassed to be in a superhero movie for once.
Oh, speaking of things that don't make sense. Look, Nivola says that he did not do any CGI work for Kraven the Hunter, and looking at this model in this action sequence, I tend to take him at his word, so, you know, good for him, I guess. It seems likely that there was always going to be some sort of physical transformation at the climax of the film, but, you know...
Not like this. Not like this.
Tellingly, during his big exposition dump on his magic backpack,
I found some.
This line is ADR.
And Professor Miles Warren.
If you didn't catch it, don't worry, it's a reference to the cult comic book character known as the Jackal, a central figure in Spider-Man mythology, particularly around the Clone Saga, which we do not have time to get into. This line adds nothing of relevance to the plot of the movie and exists solely as a reference to lore for the sake of making a reference to lore. Again, all of this stuff seems to have been added with the impetus to make the movie look and feel more like the comic books. It's worth pausing to note here that in the comic books, the supervillain known as the Rhino is actually just a guy in a suit. Ironically, Mark Webb's Amazing Spider-Man 2 did a pretty convincing job of that with Paul Giamatti.
We really did have everything, didn't we?
This gets at the sense in which the urge to make these movies more comic booky has nothing to do with the context of the original comic books or the context of the adaptation that's being made, but is instead just empty, meaningless iconography. If nothing else, the composite effect of all of this ADR, these visual effects, these post-production enhancements designed to make Kraven the Hunter feel more like a comic book, illustrate that fidelity is not a virtue of itself. It doesn't matter whether a film contains references and in-jokes to the source material, if those references and in-jokes to the source material serve to disrupt the narrative flow and general function of the movie around them. While we'll never know exactly what happened, looking at all of these choices in aggregate, it seems likely that J.C. Chandor shot a relatively grounded urban thriller with a pretty great cast. There are glimpses of a movie in Kraven the Hunter that don't seem too far removed from his work on A Most Violent Year or even Triple Frontier, but with a pulpy comic book twist on top. Indeed, it's possible to look at these early sequences in Kraven the Hunter and imagine a much more fun B-movie that looks and feels more like Lexi Alexander's Punisher Warzone than whatever the hell this is. However, it really feels like Sony saw this version of the movie and decided that it didn't contain enough Easter eggs to appeal to rabid fans, and so hastily and clumsily tried to add more superpowers, more mysticism, more name-dropping, and more computer-generated imagery to offer a facsimile of what a comic book movie should look like in 2024. The film also includes a couple of fairly blatant shoutouts to much more popular superhero movies as well, although it's also entirely possible that J.C. Chandor is a big fan of Hobbs and Shaw. None of this is to suggest that there is some masterpiece of a version of a Kraven the Hunter movie buried in the Sony archives. The film was likely conceptually flawed from the outset, a movie about a character whose entire comic book existence is defined by Spider-Man, but who now has to operate independent of Spider-Man. Still, it's very hard to believe that this original version of Kraven the Hunter could have been any worse than the movie that was actually released in theaters. I find myself staring at the theatrical release of Kraven the Hunter and just thinking,
look at what you became.
I've been Darren Mooney, and this was The Backdrop.